My name is Duncan McDonald, and with me I have one of my students from AUC of Rodina. And thank you very much for coming to this talk. Originally, when we were discussing what the talk would be about, it seemed like a good idea to talk about time-based media and to kind of frame a bit of the work that's gone into this very interesting show here at Manuel Palace that our Dishit has put a lot of effort into producing. I'm a Canadian artist who's been working for a number of years in academia and outside of academia, and I work with a variety of media, often coming back to sound. So I'm a visual artist working with sound in different ways. So today what we're going to do is we're doing a bit of an experiment here. I'm going to be reading from an academic text that I've created that outlines some of the philosophies and some of the ideas that go into the foundation that supports contemporary art. Whether it's neo-conceptual, whatever kind it is, it's important to kind of give you a bit of a framework of understanding here. And I think what we're going to do is Rudy will be reading another text alongside me, literally, and I'll be playing a video work simultaneously that I've kind of added some text to as well. We're going to bombard you with a lot of information, and at the end we're going to kind of discuss this information and how you've received it. I would get you to think about some of what we're giving you as kind of noise. And I will be talking about noise and talking about the human sensorium and how we perceive and how we understand art, but also very simple things like how we look, how we listen, how we hear, and how we see. This is very important within kind of the foundations of talking about contemporary art. So, without further ado, just so you know, this is a video work from nearly 10 years ago. I was playing just as people were entering. The piece is called Work, Work, and it's a stop motion piece I did in Canada. And very simply, it's about how do you be an artist, a father, and a professor simultaneously and do all of these things well? How do you juggle all of these things? So for me, my son was 6 months at the time. He was just crawling. And in this piece, I'm crawling to work. And where I'm working is actually at the time where I was about to show an exhibition. So it's about compressing a whole bunch of ideas tightly together, not simply because conceptually they're all utopian, but actually because pragmatically, as an artist, sometimes you have to be resourceful in how to use your time. So time is something I'll be talking about a fair amount today as well. Okay, if I can, 1 second. So the culture of noise and invisible history. For 25 centuries, Western knowledge has tried to look upon the world. It has failed to understand that the world is not for beholding. It is for hearing. It is not legible but audible. Our science has always desired to monitor, measure, abstract, and castrate meaning, forgetting that life is full of noise and that death alone is silent. Work, noise, noise of man and noise of beast. Noise bought, sold, or prohibited. Nothing essential happens in the absence of noise. This statement resonates. It boldly sheds light on an ocular-centric history, a history that has been excised from and integrated back into the cortex of visuality. Seeing is anything except knowing. It is rather an affirmation that the visible world mirrors the mind's eye. Our ocular-centric history is blind to the ontology it is so graphically born. This eternal recurrence in modernity itself seems a kind of unbreakable cycle that I'll attempt to unwind through research around the invisible, namely the noise of modernity. The term itself, noise, is questionable. What differentiates noise from sound and music? Why are distinctions made? Where can these triadic areas overlap? Nothing links these elements of audible perception, rien. Noise, music, and sound are culturally determined phenomena. Without anthropologizing these mutually exclusive bits of invisibility, I'll attempt to delineate throughout this piece where distinctions can and cannot occur in this triadic relationship. However, these audible forms, as Plato could have called them, are nothing without perceiving them. So within a somewhat Hegelian model of sensual manifestation of thought, and importantly to me, art, we will explore the relations between knowledge and listening through artists, musicians, and writers.
حكى والله أعلم أنه كان فيما مضى من قديم الزمان والأوان ملك من ملوك ساسان بمغرب الهند والصين، صاحب بنت وأعوان وخدم حشم، له ولدان وأحدهما كبير والآخر صغير. وفي يوم من الأيام اشتاق الكبير إلى أخيه الصغير، فأمره وزيره أن يسافر إليه فحضره أخوه الصغير، فأجابه بالسمع والطاعة، وسافر حتى وصل بسلامة ودخل على أخيه وبلغه السلام وعلمه أن أخاه مشتاق إليه وقصده أن يزوره، فأجابه بالسمع والطاعة، وتجهز وأخرج خيامه وجباله وخدمه وأعوانه، وأقام وزيرا حاكما به بلاده، وخرج طالبا بلاد أخيه. فلما كانت بنصف الليل تذكر حاجة نزيهة في قصره، فرجع ودخل قصره فوجد زوجته راقدة في فراشها معلقة عبدا أسود من العبيد. فلما رأى هذا اسودت الدنيا في وجهه وقال في نفسه: إذا كان هذا الأمر قد مر ووقع وأنا ما فرقت المدينة، فكيف حال هذه العامة إذا غبت عند أخي مدة ثم أنه سل سيفه وضرب الاثنين فاقتلهما في الفراش ورجع من وقته وساعته، وصار إلى أن وصل إلى مدينة أخيه، ففرح أخوه بقدومه ثم خرج إليه ولقاه وسلم عليه، والآخر صغير وكان الكبير أفرس من الصغير، وقد ملك البلاد وحكم بالعدل بين العباد وأحبه وأهله في بلاده ومملكته، وكان اسمه الملك شهريار، وكان أخوه الصغير اسمه الملك شاه. زمان وكان ملك العدل، ولم يزل الأمر مستقيما في بلاده، وكل واحد منهما في مملكته حاكم عادل في رعيته مدة 20 سنة، وهم في غاية البسط والانشراح.
Noise is a kind of information disturbance or thwarting of clear communication that's independent of the message being transmitted. Canadian composer and soundscape ecologist R. Murray Schafer writes, "Noise is an undesirable sound signal. Noise is the static on the telephone or the unwrapping of cellophane candies during Beethoven. Sometimes dissonance is called noise, and to timid ears this may be so, but consonance and dissonance are relative and subjective terms. A dissonance for one age, generation, individual may be a consonance for another age, generation, or individual." The didactic and redundant binary of consonance and dissonance are set up by Schafer as components of noise. Interpersonal subjectivity is itself a kind of noise or information disturbance linked to individual perception. My sense of noise is different than yours, as are my hearing capacities. Tolerance to noise, perception of noise, annoyance, and possibly comfort through noise are relative areas of subjectivity in this vague field of undesirable sound signals, shifting throughout cultures and epistemes. However, when Jacques Attali writes about noise within a musical context, he calls it a weapon, and music primordially is the formation, domestication, and ritualization of that weapon of a simulacrum of ritual murder. Within the context of grouping of communication transmission, Attali's description of noise has little to do with Schafer's musical terms. Rather, it focuses on the process through which and by which noise occurs, with a sender, sending device, and receiver. A noise is a resonance that interferes with the audition of a message in the process of emission, he states. A resonance is a set of simultaneous pure sounds of determined frequency and differing intensity. Noise then does not exist in itself, but only in relation to the system within which it is inscribed: emitter, transmitter, receiver.
لم يزال على هذه الحالة إلى أن أفرح به غاية الفرح، وكان له المدينة وجلس معه يتحدث بإشراف. فتذكر الملك شاه زمان ما كان من أمر زوجته، فحصل عنده غم زائدا واصفر لونه وضعف جسمه. فلما رأى أخوه على هذه الحالة ظن في نفسه أن ذلك بسبب فراسته بلاده وملكه، فترك سبيله ولم يسأل عن ذلك. ثم أنه قال له في بعض الأيام: يا أخي، أنا في باطني جرح، ولم يخبره بما رأى من زوجته، فقال: إني أريد أن تسافر معي إلى الصين، لعله ينشرح صدرك، ذلك فسافر أخوه وحده إلى الصيد. وكان في قصر الملك وزير تدل على بستان أخيه، فنظروا وإذ بباب القصر قد خرج منه 20 جارية و20 عبدا وامرأة أخيه تمشي بينهما وهي مخشية في الحسن والجمال، فتوصلوا إليه وخلعوا ثيابهم وجلسوا مع بعضهم، وإذا بامرأة قالت يا مسعود، فجاءها عبد الأسود فعانقها ووقعها، وكذلك بقى العبيد. فعلوا بالجواد ولم يزالوا في بوس وعراق ونحو ذلك حتى ولي النهار. فلما رأى أخوه الملك فقال والله إن بنيتني من هذه الذرية قد هان من عنده من القهر واللعن. وقال هذا أعظم مما جرى لي ولم يزل في أكل وشرب. وبعد هذا جاء أخوه من السفر فسلم على بعضهما، ونظر الملك إلى أخيه الملك شاب زمان وقد رد لونه وأحمر وجهه وصار يأكل بشهية بعدما كان قليل الأكل، فتعجب من ذلك وقال يا أخي كنت أراك مسفر الوجه والآن قد رد إليك لونه، فأخبرني. فحلف فقال له أما تغير لوني فأذكره لك وأعفى عني إخبارك برد لوني. فقال له أخبرني أولا بتغيير لونك وضعفك حتى أسمعك. فقال له يا أخي إنك لما أرسلت وزيرك إلى الحضور بين يديك جهزت حالي وقد جربت من مدينتي، ثم أني تذكرت الخزرة التي أعطيتها لك.
Attali links listening to music as an ordered noise. Listening to music is listening to all noise, realizing that its appropriation and control is a reflection of power that is essentially political. The socio-political observation is central to his philosophy, where the enculturation and controlling of noise is contextualized within a framework of political economy. According to Attali, recording, marketing, promoting, and distributing music as a commodity have been major features of Western capitalism. His writings on all noise, infused with socio-economic language, differ significantly from John Cage's formal concerns in music. 20th century composer Cage draws a distinction between noise and sound, stating a sound has four characteristics: frequency, amplitude, timbre, and duration. Silence, or ambient noise, has only duration. With this concise statement from silence, the composer links sound and silence together through the commonality of duration. If this silence and all sound can be homogenized through time and duration, how and when will we perceive them? Within this praxis is our mortality bound to the limits of duration. Perhaps more than any artist of the 20th century, Cage can be acknowledged to have bridged the formal and conceptual gaps between performing, recording, and integrating all of the above into notational and documentation systems. Within Cage's organization of sound, we find a non-hierarchical system where noise and music are virtually synonymous. Cage profoundly explores all sound and the potential forms it may take. From 1961, he writes, I believe the use of noise to make music will continue and increase until we reach music produced through the aid of electrical instruments, which will be available for musical purposes and any and all sounds that can be heard. Photoelectric, film, and mechanical mediums for the synthetic production will be explored. Whereas in the past the point of disagreement has been between dissonance and consonance, it will be in the immediate future between noise and so-called musical sounds. Although the great form of the future will not be as it was in the past, at one time the fugue, another time the sonata, it will be related to these as they are to each other through the principle of organization or man's common ability to think. وجلس في الشباك المطل على البستان ساعة من الزمان، وإذا بالجواد disembodied notational and recording technologies as function of mortality. From Walter Benjamin, Leonardo compares painting and music as follows. Painting is superior to music because, unlike unfortunate music, it does not die as soon as it's born. Music, which is consumed in the very act of its birth, is inferior to painting, which the use of varnish has rendered eternal. Benjamin. Leonardo da Vinci affirms the superiority of painting over music, the time-space continuum frozen within the varnish of an eternal liquidity. Music suffers the plague of durational flow as a liquid state that dissipates in Leonardo's space before durational flow is capturable, recordable, and disembodied from the soundscape of history to never play back in the liquid future. In any analog system of recording and playback, the means of rendering or capturing information, audio, visual, tactile, has to be congruent with the output apparatus. This model of re-representing reflects back on the systemic flow of an apparatus. The machine ontologizes itself as a projection of spirit, replacing the mechanics of perception. R. Schaefer describes the divisive process of separating self and the external soundscape as such. The discovery of packaging and storing techniques, or recording, for sound and the splitting of sounds from the original context, which I call schizophonia. Schaefer goes on to describe the split between the sound from the actual sound being produced itself as a kind of fundamental split for nature. Originally, all sounds were original. They occurred at only one place at only one time. Sounds were then indissolubly tied to the mechanisms that produced them. We have split the sound from the maker of the sound. Sounds have been torn from their natural sockets and given an amplified and independent existence. If documentation and notational devices differ in durational and experiential frameworks, potentially beyond our mortality, what is the palpable aesthetic reference? Rainer Maria Rilke's writing on a synesthetic experience when transcribing fissure patterns from the human skull into phonographic needle information is an example of impossible transcription. That is an analog system of notation seeking the primal sound of the universe through the mortal skull. Rilke writes, what would happen? A sound would necessarily result, a series of sounds, music, feelings, which? Incredulity, timidity, fear, awe. Which of all the feelings here possibly prevents me from suggesting a name for the primal sound which would then make its appearance in the world? What variety of lines then, occurring anywhere, could one put under the needle and try out? Is there any contour that one could not, in a sense, complete in this way and then experience it, as it makes itself felt, thus transformed in another field or sense? This incongruous relationship between analog recording, the tiny fissure cracks of the human skull that are traces of growth and physiological information, and analog playback passing the tone arm and needle on the disparate surface of the skull, is a synesthetic, and as Susan Buck-Morse mentions, open-ended system of crossed wires. This phonographic process is a schizoforming apparatus where the voice of primal sound renders itself as a function of the senses. Susan Buck-Morse elaborates on the significance of technoaesthetics in the system and language around synesthesia in saying, technology thus develops with a double function. On the one hand, it extends the human senses, increasing the acuity of perception, and forces the universe to open itself up to penetration by the human sensory apparatus. On the other hand, precisely because this technological extension leaves the senses open to exposure, technology doubles back on the senses as protection in the form of the machine, as tool, has its correlation in the development of the machine as armor. It follows that the synesthetic system is not a constant in history. It extends its scope, and it is through technology that this extension occurs. Long play. Thomas Edison, his phonographic records prove that an audiovisual document is full of visually vibrational information. The mechanics of the record player are analogous to the recording process itself. Microphones are magnetically charged receptors for electrical impulses. These impulses seek release through their polar opponents. In this model, electricity not only powers the apparatus, but also provides the means by which content is made audible. AC current, the invention of Tesla, is important here, giving electricity a voice and a means through which it can be experienced. Tesla helps power a matrix of information. Vinyl, however, knows little about what drives it at 33 1/3 RPMs in little spiral jetties. A precious stone follows nearly parallel grooves. Cutting into lacquer, its impressions are incised onto the surface with great precision. As with the French Impressionists and their new paints, new technology makes innovative art. The portable paint of 19th century France is now hard vinyl, rotating on a spinning palette. The sun is replaced and displaced with electricity. Now the flow of rivers, reflected in the light of the sun, leads to hydro dams, reintroducing the power of electricity to our ears. Both Armory Schaefer and Rodney Graham contend that the vinyl in its youth led to the standard 3-minute pop song. The first mass-produced vinyl records were this length, 10 inches by 3 minutes. Millions of recordings later, do pop songs seem to sound best around 3 minutes? Is this a causal connection between durational popularity and records? In 78, I was 33, having been born in 45. The mass popularity of vinyl was due largely to its mass production. Call it redundancy in distribution. Not long ago, musicians wrote, played, and orchestrated their works into 3 minutes to accommodate their music to the limitations of vinyl. Unwinding the technology around vinyl itself was a huge task. The advent of AC current, advancements in electromagnetic wiring, and developing a means of recording and playback, being analogous or analog, were highly significant feats. Douglas Kahn writes on this immortalizing phonograph, documenting the voice as a mortal time machine, explaining, commonly referred to as the talking machine, the machine that talks, die Sprechmaschine, and the phonograph, or voice writing. It was a good machine for the rumor-like circulation of voices. Cultural tropes of panorality and all sound, all voices began to proliferate. The more became a fixture within society. It was at this point that Edison sought to make it a fixture within all the society that had ever been. By inventing a machine to communicate with the dead, the communication itself was ostensibly indiscriminate.
له بالكامل ذات حسن وجمال وبهاء، وقد اعتدلا الكبيرة اسمها شمرائزات والصغيرة اسمها دميازات. وكانت الكبيرة قد قرأت الكتب والتاريخ وسير الملوك المتقدمين وأخبار الأمم الماضيين. قيل أنها جمعت 1000 كتاب من كتب التواريخ المتعلقة بالأمم السافلة والملوك الخالية والشعراء، فقالت لأبيها: بلي أراه صغيرا حامل الهم والأحزان. فلما سمع الوزير من ابنته هذا الكلام حكى لها ما جرى له من الأول إلى الآخر مع الملك، فقالت له: بالله يا أبتي، زوجني هذا الملك، فإما أن أعيش وإما أن أكون فداء البنات المسلمين وسببا لخلاصهما من بين يديه. فقال له: بالله عليك لا تخاطري بنفسك أبدا. فقالت له: لابد من ذلك. فقال: أخشى عليك أن يحصل لك ما حصل للحمار والطور مع صاحب الزرع. فقالت له: ما الذي جرى له يا أبتي؟
The act of speaking is itself a communication with the cogito. The sound, timbre, and loudness of my voice is largely an extension of having heard myself speak through my bony armature. I think I hate hearing the sound of my voice recorded, therefore I don't record it in the AM. Kant describes the schizoid process of utterance and documentation. When one speaks, the act of hearing one's own voice is the most widespread private act performed in public and the most common public act experienced within the comfortable confines of one's own body. Hearing one's own voice almost always passes by unnoticed, but once acknowledged, it presents itself as a closed system remaining within the experience of the individual. Roland Barthes explores this notion of listening profoundly with a kind of synesthetic language. Interpolation leads to an interlocution in which the listener's silence will be as active as the locutor's speech. Listening speaks, one might say. He points out in his writings from the Responsibility of Forms that hearing is a physiological phenomenon. Listening is a psychological act. Listening is the oral equivalent of the ocular looking. Seeing is not necessarily active. It can be passive, as in Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerke, where the audience is alienated from the seamless audiovisual spectacle of the phantasmagoria, yet bears witness to its epic unfolding through unknowingly active passivity. However, our ears are always open. Our eyes can be selectively shut. Why do we learn to be selective about what we hear? This communication with the cogito is found in the writings of Schaeffer on orality in the soundscapes of pre-industrial to post-industrial civilization. He writes, language is communication through arrangements of phonemes called words. Music is communication through arrangement of tones and sound objects. Ergo, language is sound as sense. Music is sound as sound. Printed language is silent information. Unlike Barthes' notion that listening speaks, Schaeffer's printed language is silent information, Braille included. However, central to my concerns here, language is a technology that bears witness to an ocular-centric history. Even finding the appropriate language to express metaphors and figures of speech outside visual frameworks is a great challenge. Marshall McLuhan describes this problem as such. As our age translates itself back into the oral and auditory modes because of the electronic pressure of simultaneity, we become sharply aware of the uncritical acceptance of visual metaphors and models by many past centuries.
شيئا يسيرا فأصبح الصواب يأخذ الدور إلى الحرف ووجده ضعيف. قال له: رجع آخر النهار شكرا النهار على تغطيته حين أراحه من التعب في ذلك اليوم فلم يرد على الحمار جوابا وندم أشد الندامة فلما رجع كان ذلك اليوم.
Onomatopoeia is an example of a break from the ocular-centric technology of language, where the written word is in fact a sound effect, and sometimes the verbal feeling a word impresses upon the speaker, a self-reflexive system that echoes without mirroring, its meaning as experiential and thus a posteriori. It interrupts the rationality of language as a technological function, though possible to notate and document through technology. Douglas Kahn talks about this briefly as a kind of bodily experience. Such acts of motivated speech may not be congruent with the things to which they refer, but at least a link has been made through which various associations and intensities can be played on. However, when the onomatopoeia refers to bodily sounds associated with speech itself, then another order of association occurs. The Italian futurists utilize onomatopoeia as a representation of technologies, delineating the body as a kind of mechanism that's inferior and subservient to industrial apparatuses. And I should just note that actually Marinetti, the leader of the futurists, was born in Alexandria. I'm not sure if everyone's aware of that. In his treatise, The Art of Noise, Luigi Russolo wrote, "Recently, the poet Marinetti, in a letter from the trenches of the Adrianopolis, described to me with marvelous free words the orchestra of a great battle. Every 5 seconds, a siege cannon gutting space with a chord, zang, tum, tum, mutiny of 500 echoes, smashing, scattering it to infinity. In the center of this hateful zang, tum, tum area of 50 square kilometers, leaping, bursts, lacerations, fists, rapid batteries." Russolo from 1913. This is an associative language where text signifies sound effects and the cause and the effects of the mechanical. It is a romanticization of the self as mechanical other. Importantly, this irrational lexicon is the antithesis of rational Cartesian space, of self-doubt and unknowing. It is precisely the opposite. The body utters the feelings that represent external pressures forced onto itself. Technology zooms along, oblivious to this language of muscle tissue, or as Douglas Kahn would call it, meat.
وقد سمع صاحبنا يقول إن لم يقع فور من موضعه فأعطوه للجزار ليذبحه ويستخدمه قطعا وأنا خايف عليك ونصحتك والسلام. فلما سمع فور كلمة الله شكره وقال في النفس أصبح معهما ثم أن الثور أكل عفه حتى لحق المريض بلسانه كل ذلك وصاحبهما يسمع كلامهما فلما طلع النهار وخرج التاجر وزوجته من الدار وجلس فجأة الصواب ورخت الفور وخرج فلما رأى الثور صاحبه حرك ظهره فضحك التاجر حتى استرخى على قدمه فقالت له زوجته من أي شيء تضحك؟ فقال لها شيء رأيته وسمعته ولا أقدر أن أبيح به فقالت له لابد أن تخبرني بذلك العمام سبب ضحك ولو كنت تموت. فقال لها ما أقدر أن أبوح به خوفا من الموت. فقالت له أنت لم تضحك إلا علي. ثم أنها لم تزل تلح عليه وتلح في الكلام إلى أن غلبت عليه فانحير وأحضر أولاده وأرسل إلى القاضي والشهود وأراد أن يمسي ثم يبوح لهما بالسجن ويموت لأنه كان يحبهما محبة عظيمة لأنها بنت عمه وأم أولاده وكان ذلك. ثم أنه أرسل وأحضر جميع أهلها وأهل مرته وقال لهما حكايته وأنه مات قال لأحد أعزائه مات فقال لها جميع الناس ممن خرج بالله عليك اتركي هذا الأمر لئلا يموت زوجك أبو أولادك. فقالت لهما لا أرجع عنه حتى يكون لي والأول يموت فسكتوا عنه. ثم أن التاجر قام من عندهم وتوجه إلى دار الجواب يتوضأ ثم رجع وقال لهما فيموت. وكان عنده تحت 50 دجاجة وكان عنده كلب فسمع التاجر الكلب وهو ينادي به ويسبه ويقول له أنت فرحان وصاحبنا ونحن. فقال الذئب للكلب وكيف ذلك الأمر فأعاد الكلب علي الاسم. فقال له والله إن صاحبنا قليل العقل أنا لي 50 زوجة أرضي هذه وأخطب هذه وهو ما له إلا زوجة واحدة ولا يعرف صلاح الله معه فما له لا يأخذ لها بعض من إدانة ثم يدخل إلى حجرها ويضربها حتى تموت قبله ولا تعود تسأله عن شيء.
Ordinary accidents. Perhaps one of the best ways to be honest and true to the process of experimentation is to not be good at it. By this I mean that the amateur has little to lose in experimenting in a field that he or she leaves to the experts. However, the amateur has much to gain here. We, amateurs and outsiders, have something sadly missing from the expert's agenda: a passion for play. Spiel, as Adorno and Benjamin called it, is the art of playing. Within the recent, and I want to really emphasize recent, development of modernity, play has been lost to newness. Shadows of utilitarianism lurk behind the luster of newness. Ordinary accidents and chance operations have their history through the works of Mallarmé, Burroughs, Duchamp, Dadaist, Cage, Fluxus artists, Mozart, even himself was having credited with an aleatoric composition. The list goes on. Cage's connection to the I Ching or the Book of Changes was instrumental in writing a number of complex pieces. However, artists who have best understood chance know it is not lucky. Chance is nothing, made apparent and more or less importantly post-structural. Chance is to honesty as honesty is to thought. Sometimes they align, sometimes noticeably. Chance has served different purposes for different artists. It can displace the ego of artists as a subject of desire, and if the ego isn't busy concerning itself with self-actualization, it can be lost, suspending and pointing us to the other. Kantian aesthetics are made irrelevant within this paradigm. Chance knows little about dialectics and aesthetics predicated on truths. The artist is a kind of conduit through which art is made, serves a fairly romantic purpose. In this model, art is ubiquitous. However, there's liminal space between chance as fate and chance as disorder, or a relative lack of order. Does it change form and flee interpretation in this analysis? Paul Virilio writes, "The word accident, derived from the Latin accidens, signals the unanticipated, that which is unexpectedly befalling the system, the mechanism or product, its surprise, failure, or destruction. Accidents are made of chance just as ideas are made of concepts. In this system, Virilio describes the accident as part of an overall design, where the invention of the train, for example, occasions the invention of the train wreck. The accident, or that which is waiting to happen, is a device of mine that shapes me as I try to give it form. The accident is shapeless and conforms to its formlessness just as I attempt to give it meaning. As soon as I attempt to fix it in meaning, it shifts forms, like an anxiously fleeting entity, avoiding representation. The accident cannot represent things, only a version of nothingness. It's a void, or as Trinti Minha might say, a void within a void. The accident is friend and enemy to hindsight in that it reasons with nothing, just as hindsight is a kind of reverse foresight, reasoning only with time."
ثم النتائج القومي عنهم متوجهة إلى دولة الدواب للمبدأ ثم رجع يحدثهما غير أنتما فرحنا وصاحبنا رواية أنت فرحان وصاحبنا رواية النوم فقال في ذلك وكيف ذلك الأمر فأعاد الهلف عليه القصة فقال له أدي والله إن صاحبنا قليل العقل أنا لي 50 زوجة أرضي هذه وأقبل هذه وهو ما له إلا زوجة واحدة ولا يعرف صلاح أمرها معه فما له لا يأخذ لها بعضا من العلاج أيها الملك إنني أختا صغيرة أريد أن أودعها. فأرسلها الملك إليها فجاءت إلى أختها وعانقتها وجلست تحت السرير. فقام الملك وأخذ بكرتها ثم جلسوا يتحدثون. فقالت لها أختها الصغيرة بالله عليك يا أختي حديثا نقطع به سهر ليلتك. فقالت حبا وكرما إن أذن الملك المهدد. فلما سمع ذلك الكلام وجد به قلق فرح وسمعه.
The mechanics of the accident derive from a ratio between design and work, where efficiency is the goal in the equation. Work done divided by the time in which it is done, work being the distance something is moved. This is how accidents occur. Chaos theory versus fate. With the discovery of hindsight, chaos and fate are bound together in an uneasy marriage of convenience. They reproduce and create binary oppositions in the form of dialectical philosophy. In retrospect, Plato's cave is largely about hindsight. We're not looking at truth. Why Plato chose the sense of vision still escapes me. Instead, we see its shadows on the wall of the cave. Truth and knowledge are aligned with this well-lit universe. Merleau-Ponty, using a language based on experience and a posteriori's, writes, "The world is not what I think, but what I live through. I am open to the world. I have no doubt that I am in communication with it, but I do not possess it. It is inexhaustible. There is a world, or rather, there is the world. I can never completely account for this ever reiterated assertion of my life." We escape Plato's cave with the help of Merleau-Ponty. I'd be bold enough to suggest there is no truth that we should be seeking outside the cave. There is no truth outside or in the cave, just as there is no truth in and out of the cave. Why not transform the cave into something else? How about we call it our bodies? If we make noise in this new cave, does it echo with uncertainty, pluralism, or marginalism? I know what I know, not because I am me, but rather because I need to know I feel something. That need is a desire that extends from me to others. It makes me want to be with others, with friends and strangers and family. It's easy to criticize chance and its unintentional baggage, since it often lacks a voice. The politics of hindsight are apparent. The enculturation of the senses and specialization between disparate utilitarian fields leads us nowhere quickly. The commodification of the senses is a frightening reality. The visual is being commodified at light speed, the audible slowly trailing behind. Epistemological shifts throughout modernity, and perhaps more importantly, throughout the economics of modernity, have led us to the birth of the specialist. Today, the contemporary artist is perhaps one of the very few citizens who incorporate daily work into daily life. If I'm not a professional artist, I'm an amateur, an outsider, and even a marginal member of that illustrious camp of the outsider. Is the amateur maybe the new avant-garde?
ففي الليلة الأولى قالت بلغني أيها الملك السعيد أنه كان تاجر من التجار كثير المال والمعاملات في البلاد. وكان يوما وخرج يطالب في بعض البلاد فاشتد عليه الحر فجلس تحت شجرة وحط يده في خرجه وأكل كسرة كانت معه وتمرة. فلما فرغ من أكل التمرة رمى نواه وإذا هو بعفريت طويل القامة بيده سيف من ذلك التاجر وقال له قم حتى أقتله مثل ما قتلت ولدي. قال له التاجر كيف
unfinished endings. My sixth sense tells me that the other five will be routinely exploited before their obsolescence. Schubert's Unfinished Symphony No. 8 is romantic, passionate, and most importantly, unfinished. However, the reasons why Schubert did not finish this work are perhaps more interesting than the actual score. In one word, funding. He lost his financial support for the project. This was his pain, not the torment of a romantically tormented artistic soul. I often receive criticism that my art's not resolved and appears unfinished. To this I say thank you. Thanks for coming to the show. In fact, you are the show. Without it, there would be nothing, rien. You complete the show. I cannot and will never complete my work. Such acts would be monotonous dialogues with my mind's eye or inner ear, proving sad and lonely. I don't want this to end. If it does, our relation may dissolve into nothing. Nonetheless, and nothingness included, thank you, de rien.
أتعلم أيها العفريت أن هذه الغزالة هي بنت عمي ومن لحمي ودمي وكنت تزوجت بها وهي صغيرة في السن وأقمت معها نحو 30 سنة فلم أرزق منها بولد فأخذت لي سرية فرزقت منها بولد ذكر كأنه البدر. إذا بدا بعينين ملحتين وحاجبين مزلزلتين وأعضاء كاملة فكبر شيئا فشيئا إلى أن صار ابن 15 سنة طرأت لي سفرة إلى بعض المدن فسافرت متجر عظيم وكانت بنت عمي هذه الغزالة تعلمت السحر والكهانة من صغرها فسحرت ذلك الولد عجلا وسحرت الجارية أمة حقا وسلمتها إلى الراعي ثم جئت أنا بعد مدة طويلة من السفر فسألت عني ولدي وعن أمه فقالت لي جارتك ماتت وابنك هرب ولم أعلم أين راح. جلست مدة سنة وأنا حزين القلب باكي العين إلى أن جاء عين القطر فأرسل إلي الراعي أن يخصني ببقرة سمينة وهي سرتي التي سحرتها تلك الغزالة. فشمرت ثيابي وأخذت السكين بيدي وتهيأت لذبحها فصاحت وبكت بكاء شديد فقمت عنها وأمرت ذلك الراعي بذبحها فسلخها فلم يكن فيها شحم ولا لحم غير بنت وعظم فندمت على ذبحها حيث لا ينفعني الندم وأعطيتها للراعي وقلت له أتني بعجل سمين فأتني بولدي المسؤول عجلا فلما رآني ذلك العجل قطع حبله وجاءني وتمرد علي ولولا وبكى فأخذتني رأفة عليه وقلت للراعي أتني ببقرة ووردة عليه فأدرك شهرزاد بالصباح فسكتت عن الكلام بالباب قالت له ما أطيب حديثك وعجبته وألينه وأعلمه فقالت أين هذا بما أحدثكم به الليلة القابلة إن عشت أبقاني الملك فقال الملك نفسه والله ما أحكمها حتى أسمع بقية حديثها ثم أنه باتت تلك الليلة إلى الصباح متعنقين فخرج الملك إلى محل حكمه وطلع الوزير التفت تحته ثم حكم الملك ولي وعزله إلى آخر النهار ولم يخبر الوزير بشيء ومن ذلك فتعجب الوزير غاية العجب ثم انفض الديون ودخل الملك شهريار كسرى.
Great, thank you. We can open it up now for questions, though questions might be tricky. As this was a bit of an experiment, I think you've probably understood at this point. But again, just to kind of reiterate from what I said from the beginning, I wanted to try to look at some of the foundations, as the groundwork philosophically, to think about things as simple as looking, listening, seeing, hearing, and ways that artists work within contemporary art to explore the body and technology, systems, all of these kinds of things. I guess one other thing I'll say, I explained the piece that I was presenting as people were walking in. This is a work I've slightly modified for this talk to have text show up once every minute to kind of act as noise to this conversation. It's called Piano Burn. It was from 2012, and it was shot in Canada. For it, what I was doing was investigating. For much of my work, I've been investigating the history of the piano and the pianoforte. and kind of unpacking it. Sometimes I play it, you know, quite self-taught, messing around with it. Sometimes I pull it apart and I look at things like the ivory on it, right? So the history of the ivory trade is something very interesting in terms globally what's happened. And you still find this to this day. This is happening throughout Africa and Kenya and whatnot. They just did one a couple of weeks ago where they burned these massive piles of ivory, you know, that have been harvested or poached in different parks from rhinos and elephants and whatnot. And they're trying to get it off of the black market. Right now there's a huge demand for it in East Asia. So for me, it's been part of my research investigating, pulling the piano apart into different pieces, and also to look at it too in terms of its, what it means in a socio-political context. It was invented largely with the rise of the bourgeoisie, which is interesting. So concert halls were created. You had bigger concert halls where more people could go to them because you had a middle class that could afford. It wasn't the ultra elite royals, you know, and it wasn't the peasants, it was somewhere in between. You could have bigger spaces. So you had to be able to fill those concert halls and have bigger sounds. So the piano basically came from that. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, one of the best writers on the subject is Edward Said. Not a lot of people know this, but actually he's done a lot of research and writing on music and its history between the East and West and where they collide. It's probably some of the best writing that's out there, actually. So take a look. He himself was a musician, just you know. So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments, however you want to approach this.
I think I would like to ask about this, the structural performance.
Sure.
And why you choosing that structure, especially when it comes to a narrative structure like Alfiya stories.
Yeah.
And what's your perspective in choosing this particular kind of series?
Yeah.
Is it because it's linked to maybe in your perspective, like the ancient Arabic literature, or Persian literature, or this area of time,
Yeah.
in relation to your own work and your own representation, sound, and practices? Is it philosophically or politically in connection, or you create some kind of questions?
Right.
What kind of questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think part of it is that I'm familiar with some of the stories, but obviously not in Arabic. So this had to do with kind of familiarity, but it was also a bit of a chance operation, right? So I talked a little bit about chance within here, and I'm interested in setting up systems where you can control certain elements and then you don't, and then certain things unfold. You know, Cage, I mentioned the artist who played around a lot with that. But I also wanted that for the audience, I guess I made kind of the assumption that the audience would be fairly familiar with with this narrative, and to think about it in relationship to maybe a little bit of the unfamiliarity in terms of where I'm coming from. Basically, it's all about chance operations and levels of familiarity. I understand them, but maybe not as well as some people do in this room. And I think that's, for me, kind of, I think, philosophically kind of important. And I think in getting Rodina to help here, I thought was also kind of an interesting element where I had her choose without like me kind of telling her. So I kind of wanted to add another level. The other simple answer is noise. Because for me, I mean, I'm setting up this chance operation, but I also really kind of wanted to investigate how you could stack noise like formally in terms of what we hear or what we see, but also conceptually, right? Where there's kind of blockades.
Is her way of reading is part of this noise thing?
Oh, you're...
I thought the same.
Right. Right.
Is it part of your concept as creating noise but reading?
I think this is, no, not necessarily.
No, we didn't discuss how I would read them, but then but then I read his text and it was basically about noise, and then when we were talking about it, it was generally like a performance-ish thing where there's sound and then there's video with text and then him talking and then maybe I cross-talk. So
I think it's
it
all
was a
about
monotonic thing
continuous,
that
more
just...
continuous loop of taking up in the journey of your sound.
Well,
Yeah.
actually,
You're not actually listening to
That's
what
interesting.
Yeah.
this is actually was
Interesting. Okay.
but the
I like-
interesting thing is that
What
for
you're trying to
me,
read.
for instance, for like a couple of minutes, I would I would have some selective hearing, so I
Yeah.
would hear two like sentences that would catch my attention,
Yeah.
and then I would hear the actual sound and music coming from
Yeah.
the speakers. So it was like an experiment actually,
Yeah.
because I was, and then I thought, why am I selecting what I'm listening to,
Yeah.
and I'm stopping, and then I'm drawn to the sound,
Yeah.
and then I'm drawn to the
Yeah.
sentence you're writing, so it's
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
quite interactive actually.
Yeah, and with that, like, I mean, I kind of approached it in the text, but like the difference between hearing and listening, and the difference between kind of looking and seeing, maybe too, like they are different, and it's. Oh, absolutely. We've been rehearsing this for weeks. Yeah. Yes. I love how she's, even though she's not your student, there's still criticism. I love this.
You mentioned something about
Yeah.
unfinished and founded, and what really interests me that what you said about the difference between printed language and talking and sound,
Yeah.
music,
Yeah.
in relation to information.
Yeah.
How each maybe fundamental or
Yeah.
have different representation of information.
Yeah.
Can you read? Because this is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, what I was kind of trying to look at was notational systems, right? So if you look at, the history of, like, say, Western classical music, that has this very sophisticated system of, writing out information so that it can be repeated, so others can play it, and if you look at Attali, he goes into great detail to relate that to the printing press. So, like, the composers who happened to show up when the printing press was invented did very well, right? There's a whole lot of other, composers we don't even know about because the printing press wasn't around. So part of it is the interest in looking at kind of technology and also language. Language itself as kind of a technology. I mean, if I'm not getting into it, like, I'm not even getting into the 21st century with any of this stuff. It's kind of more media art history, but the basis for everything that we're doing on a computer is kind of alphanumeric. Anyways, I'm moving away from what you're talking about. Yeah, notational systems, and also I think what I was trying to get at really at the end of all of that was time, to think about the relationship of time and technology. And Cage had a really great, kind of statement about this, was sometimes people, especially students, will say this, I don't have enough time, or I don't have enough time to get that done, or blah, 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 or you always have enough time, right? You always have enough time, right? Everybody is here, alhamdulillah, we're alive, well, yeah. but
From an organizer perspective.
right, but I mean, really, what Cage was talking about is mortality. That is your time, right? And whatever kind of things you need to do, yes, they need to happen, but your framework for time is your mortality, right? I didn't get into the afterlife. I was going to, but I didn't feel it was necessary here, and maybe what that could represent. But
That's what she is presenting, afterlife.
Hmm?
Taking us to the journey of afterlife.
okay, nice. Okay, we got a heckler up here. Yeah, I don't know if I totally answered you that with that one. I can even give you this text later so you can take a look at it. Yeah. But I think part of what I was also trying to do with this is to critique technology as well, because I think often people put technology on like a pedestal. Literally, sometimes in galleries, you put technology on a pedestal. And I think it's good to be critical. Like McLuhan, if you read McLuhan pretty carefully in the 60s, he came from classics and from literature. So he was related, the Gutenberg galaxy is all about the relationship of the printing press technology to the explosion of information, but he's actually warning people too, to be cautious about its use and abuse. And Paul Virilio, who I mentioned, I think is really important. He's very, very old. He's got to be about 100 years old, but used to be one of Matisse's assistants. That's how old this guy is. But he's still alive in Paris. And, you know, he talks about like the invention of the train is the invention of the train wreck. The invention of the Autobahn is the invention of the 50-car pileup. And these are things I think we have to be looking at kind of a bit critically with technology. That's something I'm trying to do in here, and I think artists do that fairly well, messing around with obsolescent technology, which McLuhan was all about as well. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling here. Any more questions or comments or criticisms? Yeah.
Can you talk more about the piece? I mean, the piano and
Piano burn. Okay. Yeah. And
significant. I mean,
what's going on there?
first it was a complete item, and then it went back to. For me, that's the afterlife. Actually.
Right. Right.
To have something decompose and it being in nature, which is very different than the context where you see the piano is in. It's actually out of the regular context back into nature and completely decomposing and
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Its relationship to nature. It does stand out like a piano in a field. It doesn't quite make sense. But I said this once at a talk a few months ago, and people just kind of went, but in Canada, you can pretty much get pianos for free. Pianos are pretty much thrown away daily. Like if you look on like online secondhand places, they're like, please get rid of my piano. It's this interesting thing where it's part of history, it's just kind of gone. I could relate that to kind of the decline of the bourgeoisie, but I won't get into that. But I think what I was trying to do there is also, to put it in this natural, beautiful, kind of romantic kind of backdrop. But to think about, you know, it's totally out of place. Like, why were we using ivory from Africa on a piano in Canada? You know, it's only been like 20 years since this has been like outlawed, for example, which itself was kind of strange. There's actually a city in Connecticut called Ivoryton, which the PBS did a special about a couple years ago, and everybody in Ivoryton basically says to especially East Asians right now, they're like, you got to get out of the ivory trade, guys, because any inhabitant of your town or city will be left with this shameful legacy, and you can't get rid of it, right? Anyways. So in terms of this work in the afterlife, I think it's a good observation, and I do have some of the remnants of that piano. I didn't keep any of the metal or anything, but I kept some of the wood and charred remains, and I have some of it here actually in Cairo, specifically because I'm going to do some drawings with them, right? I sometimes draw with charcoal, and that's exactly kind of what charcoal is. Like its afterlife is a drawing or something to this effect. And years ago, I did a series of drawings of these trees in France that are typically cut and burnt because they're filled with disease or filled with boule d'aiguille, so mistletoe. And but it's a very romantic thing, right? I don't know who said it. It might be Nietzsche who said that, you know, true romance is the destruction of romance itself, which I think is kind of interesting. And that's kind of what I'm playing with in this piece as well. You know, think about the piano and think about all of the beauty and all the romanticism surrounding it. Put it in a field, destroy it. It's like hyper romanticized. It's taking it to this other kind of sublime level. I mean, I had the audio going, so you probably heard it where you're sitting. I was also I had several field recorders in that field, just recording the audio. And if I play it in the gallery, the beginning is actually really loud. It's of the sounds of the flames that are going. And then eventually the strings start, start going kind of thing. So I guess you hear the destruction of the thing in itself. I don't know if that kind of answered it. Okay.
That was interesting, is that I was distracted and different, and I'm like now wondering wondering why was
Right.
I selecting what to listen
Right.
to and what to read and what to see, and
Yeah.
when you think about it, as you were saying, I mean,
Yeah.
art is not just what you do, but what the viewer
Yeah.
interacts with and sees.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we're also in a funny time right now too, where a person kind of ends up being bombarded with a lot of information all the time. So mediated, these media tools that we have access to. So, doing this like 15 years ago, if I presented all of this stuff simultaneously, I think a lot of people would have just been, it's too much. But I mean, look at TV from 15, 20 years ago. Look at how slowly it moves compared to the pacing now, right? So I think that's kind of, strange and interesting. I've heard there have been some writers talk about, the 20th century was all about speed. The 21st century is about compressing information. And I think there's some accuracy in that. I feel like that's what's going on. There was one word, I don't know if you noticed it up here, it's an important one, simultaneity. This was something that was really big in the late 19th century, especially in Europe, with industrialization, right? With the advent of the telephone, people started to think about time and space differently. It's like, oh my God, you're thousands of kilometers that way, but I can hear you. How is this possible? And obviously the Cubists and everyone else took this in different directions later on. But I still think it's quite a fascinating and interesting concept. The simultaneity of what's going on in this room, like right now, in trying to even articulate that or frame it, I think is quite interesting. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a great question, and I think people tend to try to create order out of disorder. Yeah. There's a funny old text. It's not really that funny, but it might read a little funny now. The style by Rudolf Arnheim called Entropy in Art. I want to say it's like the late 70s, but it's a very scientific approach to looking at art. And basically his thesis is this, is that all matter breaks down. And so I guess kind of like the title of your show, it changes form, right? But what he states is there's a difference between matter and kind of consciousness. In consciousness, we tend to like to create systems of order or understanding because it's easier to do that. Basically, it's I don't know if there's such a thing as human nature. That's probably part of it, but matter tends to break down, whereas human consciousness tends to create order, tends to do try to like do the opposite of that, which I think is kind of strange and interesting. And he also states that you can't actually understand chaos because it's too big. It's kind of like trying to understand nothingness. You can't. It's just it's too big for our minds to kind of comprehend. But yeah, especially with art, I find people like really try to understand it and say, well, this piece is about X, Y, and Z, and like to try to confine it. Whereas I think actually very little art you can perfectly kind of encapsulate or frame. You know what I mean? I think it's hard for people to be uncertain about things, right? To just be like, okay, I don't totally understand this. Sorry? Yeah, I think so. I think so. But I think it's okay not to understand. And I think as artists, I hope people are creating different forms of ambiguity where there is no one interpretation, and hopefully it's fairly open. I hope contemporary art especially is more like a question than an answer. You know what I mean? I think people want like an answer, but it's usually opening up possibilities. It's not usually closing them down. Rudy, do you have anything you want to say?
I just think that what you just said is what happened, is this idea of alternating between most of your senses. So you're seeing something, you're also reading something on screen, but you're hearing two completely different texts with two completely different languages, and then you hear something, but you also listen to something else. So you alter between listening and hearing, but also seeing, and then this creates an ambiguity to it in itself, which I think is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Any last questions? Can I ask you guys one question or two? I mean, why not? Were there associations between the texts at times that you found and or what was here, or were there none?
Actually, yes.
Okay.
Like the structure of the piano, because I felt like it resonated with the drama and the death story.
Okay.
Like at one point, she was talking about how that one man should kill his wife, and then you started with part of the text
Mm-hmm.
with ordinary accidents, and I thought it was great.
Interesting. Oh, that's good timing then. Yeah. Interesting. I'm asking you because I don't know. Like that's why I'm asking you, right? Arabic, very shwaya.
It was like you were trying to analyze what I'm saying without knowing what I'm saying. So you were trying to just somehow understand what is going on throughout those narratives.
Yeah. That's
through like concepts, you know, and then somehow they clash or they become like a parallel paradox.
That's hilarious. That's great. There's an old film from the 90s called Ghost Dog with Forrest Whitaker. Ghost Dog? Yeah, and he's supposed to be this hitman. I won't get into the narrative, but Jim Jarmusch. It's a good film. But there's this wonderful scene that's kind of like I think what just happened there, where his best friend speaks French, and he's from Haiti, and Forrest Whitaker doesn't speak French, and he's English. But they're best friends, and they can't speak one another's language. But in the film, they're showing the subtitles, and at times they're having a conversation and they don't know it. And then sometimes they're absolutely talking about very different things, but they're very happy to be together as friends, which I find kind of an interesting bunch of us kind of associations going on there. And also, I mean, that's kind of about irony as well, right? As much as chance.
Like if you're speaking two completely different languages and we're supposed to understand each other, it's the tone, like the sound of the language is important too.
Yeah.
So it gives in kind of, or you try and grasp what I'm saying through my tones, like literally the waves, you know, or how loud it is, or if it's not at all, if it's a monotone.
Yeah.
So you just try to understand the context of it with the tones, and then it adds to the idea of sound that you were talking about.
Yeah.
A story was telling actually is collage.
Yeah.
And I think it's representing not one story, it's representing the whole thing about the whole story.
Yes. Yes.
And we took a quotation from different beginning, the very beginning when the whole story starts,
Yes.
and then the very end, الصباح ولا and then it's some kind of collage story, which it doesn't make sense. But actually it's fine. I mean, the only problem is listening to it. Because there's no any reaction, there's no any action, there's no any acting, there's no any feeling, there's nothing at all. So actually it's something maybe it's good to have this linear, non-structured narration, which is make me think actually why you're doing this to us. And this is very much
no, but I think
good,
it
I like
adds to like
it's actually
altering
good. That's what I'm saying.
between
Yeah,
listening
it's
and
nice.
hearing.
What
Yes,
you're doing.
yes.
But actually this is something very very interesting.
Yeah.
Which is
His smile is not saying
It's
that.
no, but I mean,
No, I'm saying
but you bring up an important point, Shadi, because like this is something I talk to students about all the time. Is like what you're saying and how you're saying it, right, are different things, and to be thinking about those levels of nuance, right? No. I appreciate this feedback, and what I was trying to do is like I was doing a very academic kind of paper thing here, but I was kind of actually trying to be a little bit more passionate about it than the content. So it's the same concept, right? She's taking something very intense and kind of blah, 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 and I'm very much reading an academic paper, post-structuralism, you know, like, I mean, maybe not taking it that far, but it's the same kind of concept actually, right? Yeah, I like this. This is a good analysis. Yeah, very good.